Hey there, folks. I'm Matt Hansen,
And I'm John Johnson.
and you're listening to Planes, Trains, and Comic Books, the podcast where we discuss favorites we've reread, both classic and new comics we want to read, and everything else in between.
And here's the comic we picked this week.
Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of
Planes, Trains, and Comic Books.
Today, we are finishing our Black History Month celebration with
A different
thing. What would you say?
Well, I mean, so this one is more a look at the comic book history overall. We're doing an actual book.
It's a real book.
It's a real book with words.
There are pictures, but less pictures, more
That's right.
words.
We had to actually read and learn things this time.
God damn it! We go out of our way to read actual books for you people.
Yes,
So.
but no, it's important. This is a lot of history that, and we'll say as we're getting into this, Matt did a little extra to see, because not all of it comes quite across in reading this book. But I mean, this is 15 years. You said
15 years of research to go.
15 years of a love and an appreciation and like wanting to find all of this information to get it as correct and across as possible to have these people's work known.
Yeah.
So,
and also he said in another podcast, the author of this book, that this is just part one.
oh wow.
He said he's working on a second book.
Okay.
That'll be like a companion to this. So, this book is by IDW. They released it, which is nice of them, because that's kind of a weird thing for IDW to release. They're usually not like, hey, we're going to release a book that's about the comic book industry.
Yeah.
That's more like I would say that's more like a Fantagraphics or like, I don't know, Top Shelf
Penguin
or
House.
something. Yeah, Penguin Random House, Taschen or something.
Yeah.
You know? So it's interesting of IDW to do it. But the book is called Invisible Men, the Trailblazing Black Artists of Comic Books, and is by Ken Quattro. So I heard about this book from a podcast I was listening to, and Ken Quattro was actually on it, and he, the podcast, I think it was called Thinking Critical, is the name of the podcast, and I think that's the name of the podcast. And he was interviewing this guy, and I was just like, oh, that sounds cool, like, whatever. I was listening to it at work while I was fixing. I can't remember what I was doing. I was doing something with HVAC units or whatever. So I just remember that, like, I was not paying attention to the podcast too much, and then it quickly like overtook my interest of whatever I was doing at work. So where I was just like, oh, that's really cool, like whatever this guy's talking about. So I was like, we have to do this book sometime, and we weren't necessarily waiting for Black History Month, but we hadn't done it all year because this actually came out about a year ago, and so I was like, oh, well, now that I'm thinking about it, and we need a book for Black History Month that we're kind of picking out certain books, why don't we do this one kind of to do the capstone of this Black History Month? So this one was very, very interesting. Like I said, the podcast where he's talking is just like, wow, you started researching just like, oh, what's this thing? And it became like this mountain of information that he had to sort through and get and just find in general, because there's not a lot of history, like documented history of these artists, because one, they were black in a very racist society, especially back then and everything. And then two, back then, no comic book, even if you were a white comic book artist, you didn't get your names put on the books. It's not like today when you go in to the comic book store, to get manga or even single issue comics, and it says, written by Grant Morrison, art by Frank Quietly, or whatever. It doesn't say that. Yeah. It would just be like, it's an Atlas comic, The Spy Hunter or whatever, and then the story. There was nothing about the artists or the writers in it. So that's actually how he started this. He was like, oh, this is like one of my favorite artists. I should like look into his history. And he like couldn't find anything about him. And so he had to then like go to a friend or something, and the friend was like, oh, you should talk to this person who was related to him. And then that just led him on a rabbit trail of there was all these other artists that were like contemporaries of the artists that he was looking into, and he didn't know any of them. He'd never heard of them, but apparently they were like working on all these comics that were very important in the Golden Age, and which, you know, we should also say, like, for those of you who might not be as well versed in comic book history, there are ages of comics. So there's like the Golden Age, which is generally all the stuff in comic books that is from like 1939 when Superman was started to 1962, I think, or 60.
Okay.
And then the Silver Age starts in 1960, and that's when all the comic books rebooted, like all the companies, which you know proper now. Back in the 50s, in the Golden Age, like Marvel was called Timely, and I believe DC was called National Comics. And then in the 60s, they got those companies died. Yeah. They got bought out or rebranded or whatever, and became Marvel and DC as we know them now. And that's when the Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, all the ones you know and love really came out of the Silver Age. And then you have the Bronze Age in the 70s and the 80s. And then they have different brandings depending on. In the 90s, that was called the Modern Age, but it's not the Modern Age anymore. So they're starting to call it the Copper Age.
Okay, I was gonna ask if you knew what they were gonna be calling that. Okay.
Yeah, they started calling it the Copper Age. Then there was
because it's not quite as shiny and polished.
Yeah, it's not quite as good.
It's a lot. It should call it the Pouches or Pockets Age.
Yeah. So that's not Pouches Age.
Pouches Age.
The Pouch Age. Yeah, I like that. Or the straps. But so and then, like, you know, every generation says that they're the modern age, but then eventually they're not. So they have to call it something. I have no idea what the 2000s are called. Some other shitty sort of metal, probably the 10 age.
The 10 age.
But yeah, so that's what the ages mean. When we're talking about the Golden Age, we're talking about a specific time period that's generally, I mean, comic books were definitely before 1939, but the Golden Age of comic books is like when Superman started.
Yeah.
So like, because you also had comic book strips, which they talk about a lot in this, which were in newspapers and stuff, but they didn't actually come out, I think, in actual comic book form, or at least superheroes didn't until 1939 with Superman.
Yeah, because you had, like you said, you had strips. There were people doing political cartoons, obviously.
There was
advertisement cartoons.
Yes, yeah. So, and that's what a lot of these artists were. I mean, comic books was not a job people were like, I want to do that when I grow up. Back in the day, no one said that. You know, until Rob Liefeld was on that commercial or whatever, no one said, I want to do that when I grow up. So, like when they were getting their comic book work, these are fine artists that are trained with degrees in fine art that were trying to get, you know, advertising jobs or things like that, and they couldn't. So they were like, well, I got to pay the bills somehow this month. So they would take comic book work as, like, you know, just means of getting bills paid. And then the second they didn't have to do that, they would stop doing that. So it was not like a job that anybody really wanted or, you know, stuck with until, like, I would say maybe Stan Lee was the first guy that's like, oh, like Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, those guys in the 50s, where they're like, I want to do this for the rest of my life. Or I just fell into it and I just stay into it for the rest of my life. I don't even know if like Stan wanted to be an author and was like, I'm not a writer. I'm not good enough to be a writer. I'll write comics. And then that's what he did. You know, like, so, and when you read some of those old comics, you're like, I understand. I understand, Stan, why you chose comics.
There's a lot of words on this page, Stan, and they don't all need to be there.
And they definitely don't all need to be. You need an editor, a better editor. So, it's just a very fascinating book. So I really wanted to promote this. Like I said, it's about a year old now, but you can still get it on Amazon. It's in hardcover and stuff. And I think it's on Amazon. It's cheaper than this, but it says on the back that it's $35. So, very cool book. The book has a very interesting flow to it. It starts from like the oldest to the newest, like as far as progression of artists and comic book history.
Yeah.
But
it's neat to see like a lot of them connected and overlapped and knew each other. Too,
yes, and the way he would do it was he would do one as make sure this one came before because the next guy overlaps where the other guy was already working at the place he goes to or whatever. So you know who he's talking about and everything. So it's a very good way to write the book. Also, one thing I loved about the book is he would talk about, each chapter was like he would talk about the artist and give you his whole life story from like birth, even before birth, like how his family got to whatever city they were out of, and then the birth of the artist, how their early life was, where they came up from, like what schooling they went to and all that, and then the comic book career, their death and everything, and what they did after their comic book career, and then they would actually show a good chunk, at least reprint maybe a full comic, like a full story, or just strips of a couple different ones that they did, depending on what their work was. And I liked that a lot. You could like just being able to read about it and go, oh, okay, I understand what you're talking about. But then to actually read the comic, where you're like, oh, this is like super cool and fun, and like to see how they were doing. And I was gonna say, I mean, Stan Lee wrote comics back then, and then in the '60s he kind of reinvented it for the the sci-fi age or whatever. But they used a lot less words in some of these than I thought they would for it being older than Stan Lee.
That's true. Looking at some of the ones in here in particular, like there were a couple that I was like, oh, that was actually like a fun little quick
a lot
read.
of these were fun to read, and I was like, I did not think they would be fun to read because I'm thinking of like Stan Lee old comics where it's just like, will this guy shut the fuck up?
Yeah, there's just so much exposition, and it's like, no, let the pictures tell the story.
And that might be because a lot of these people, like I said, they're uncredited anyway, but a lot of them, like the second, I think it's the second guy in this book, he did the writing and the art in it like together. Yeah. So, but they're not credited as it at all. So they're just kind of piecing that together from the history of what they were told and whatnot. But that's what it seemed like. And if it was true, I mean, they did a better job than like Stan Lee did on a lot of his '60s stuff, at least from my assessment of it. Like I do not enjoy reading some of those old Fantastic Four and Spider-Man and stuff. So while the art is fantastic, Stan Lee, not so much. But the first guy in this book, because we'll just kind of jump into it, and we're not going to cover every artist in this, obviously, because there's a lot. There's a bunch of people. I think there's like a total of like 10 or 12 separate artists or storylines that kind of go through of people or companies and stuff. But there
19.
There's 19.
Oh, yeah, wow, I was like, I felt a little more. I just counted it because I put them all on the side here.
Good job, John. 19, there's 19.
But still, yeah.
And so it definitely it covers a good chunk of people, and some are more.
Yeah, not to say that not every single person in this book is well warranted and obviously needs the credit they do. Yeah. Some of them may have just been a little more influential, a little more like maybe their impact was felt a little more.
Right, or they just stood out to me, because that's the other thing. I was kind of like, hey, John, pick out, like when you're reading, if someone stands out to you, mark that guy down and we'll talk about them. So we're not going to talk about all 19, but just you'll get the flavor of what the book's about, who we're talking about.
Plus, we want you to support Ken Quattro for doing all of this hard work.
Yeah,
and putting this all together. Yeah, exactly. Like I didn't know that until you told me, so I really look forward to like finding out more. Like this is a really cool read. And again, I know we're celebrating Black History Month, but it's good to learn about history and about
right. This is history of comic book industry, not just of Black people. In general, it's like okay, but like that's the thing. It's kind of like in any war or whatever, at the end, the conqueror is the person who writes the history. Yeah. So if there's a minority group who is unliked in society and pushed down and everything, no one's writing about them. No one's keeping this history. I was telling John, like Ken Quattro was originally like trying to find information on these people, and he couldn't find anything because the white newspapers from back then didn't write about these Black artists, and then the Black newspapers don't have archives.
Yeah.
So even though they were featured in Black newspapers, unless the family members of these people had those newspapers,
that's so crazy to
in a box or whatever, there was no record of it. So,
yeah, and that's crazy to think because you were seeing more and more of those kind of cultural artifacts like brought into places. Now I read stories every once in a while where it's like, oh, they're asking if you have anything from like, and that's because
yeah, exactly like you're saying, like I think because people in the society devalued it or wasn't even thinking about saving it. Now that it's kind of in the forefront of like, hey, there's this other side of history that we've never talked about or never, whatever, that was never taught to anybody. let's start documenting stuff from back then, whatever we can save or whatever you have. So, definitely he's going through and talking, like at least getting oral histories from relatives, or there's even some like comic creators that you know about from like, of white creators or whatever that, do get history, or history talks about them. And that they worked with these people, so they can actually go back into interviews with those people or talk to them, because some of them are still alive, and say like, hey, what was it like to work with this person or that person? And they're like, oh, okay, cool. The other thing about this book is, but the history of like how kind of fucked up the industry was back then, just in like not giving anybody credit, was they would just, like if you were the writer, you would just hand in a script. You don't have a team. Like nowadays, you hire a team to make a book, right? Back then, it would just be like, I'm the editor, or we're Timely Comics. I have writers write me scripts. I hand that script to whatever artist. It doesn't fucking matter.
Yeah.
And as long as they can get it to me in time, that's who I care about. So, or that's all I care about. So, a lot of the times, the artists or the writers didn't even know they were working with black people or anything. So they don't know to say, oh, I worked with one of the first black artists, or what. They didn't know who the fuck they're working with. Yeah. So they were just like, oh, yeah, I just work with an artist. And they're assuming they're white or whatever.
That's true. That's one of the things I did notice going through a lot of this when they're showing some of the old works. They were able to find some of the works, but because the work doesn't have anybody's name on the documents, it's like, well, they know that they did see that there was a script from the story that was by this guy, and this guy happened to work with one of this artist did a lot of it, so this is, and it looks like so this is probably, like, we can't say 100%, but
yeah, it's probably them.
Probably
them. We don't know because it's not documented anywhere.
Yeah, I know, and that's just wild to think. Like, you don't know who did this. Like,
yeah, well, but that's the thing. I mean, okay, this is gonna blow your mind. Okay, you know how much actual original art, comic book art, like a page drawn from Jack Kirby and stuff, right? You know how much that's worth now, right? Like hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
So comic book studios, before that was a thing, selling those pages, they were like, no, we own those pages. Like, the artist didn't get them back. That only started after Neil Adams. I believe it was Neil Adams in the late 70s was like, no, this is our art.
Right, yeah.
You get it, you scan it or whatever, or you take it and print it, or take photos of it, and then give it back to us because we drew it. And so then we have pages to sell at Comic-Cons or whatever, which were coming out at that time too.
Yeah.
So that started that whole thing where we could sell it. Before that, they would just be like, we'll just throw these in the fire or whatever. Yeah. Like, they're like, so much of these amazing artists' work. We're talking Steve Ditko, Jack Kirby, all of this, and then all of these artists too that are in this book, I'm sure had the same thing happen to them with any of the stuff that they handed in, just thrown away whenever the company, like, oh, there was a flood and we just kept all these in the basement. Who gives a shit? Oh, wow. It's just paper. Like, yeah, so much of this stuff before anybody thought any of it was valuable just gets thrown away or burned or whatever. And so, yeah, it's kind of like comic books being thought of as a, like, not classy. It's a medium for children, right? It's entertainment for children. Even children don't think of it as anything other than kind of a disposable entertainment too, right? Like, they roll it up, put it in their back pocket, go play hoop or whatever the stick and hoop.
That was something they did, yeah.
Yeah, or ball and cup or whatever the fuck they did back then. Go watch the serial funnies on the movie theater for 5 cents. And and then they would roll up the comics, they would read it, and then be like, cool, and then they'd throw it away.
Roll up in their back pocket, forget about it.
Exactly. It would go through the wash or whatever. Yeah. So or the mom would put it on the washboard. Whatever the fuck they did back then. But yeah, so like, it just wasn't thought of as this is something to save, or it's interesting, or people are gonna care about this a lot in 100 years or whatever. So it's just a different kind of medium than you would think.
Yeah.
It's like, obviously when people make movies, the original film of those movies, everybody knows is valuable, right? Yeah. Like, from the very beginning of silent film, people are like, this cost a lot to make, it's very valuable, but we got to make sure this doesn't get, like, thrown away, or at least the original negatives of it or whatever, So, like, all those, Universal has, I'm sure, a stock room of all their footage from every movie they've ever made that they put digitally now, probably, but at one time it was all just in a storage room. they did not give a fuck about that with comic books. They were very, temporary medium, they thought. And, so, we'll just start off because
we do. And I want to make sure we say one caveat that, all of the proper descriptions in this book are specifically, they're all brought together with the term blacks because it's the most inclusive.
Right.
Because there's a little bit of a
there are other words used, but and we might say other words, not bad words, but like,
but there's some specifically for company names.
Yeah, company names
that are owned by the black creators in this.
Yeah.
So we will use proper terms for that was part of their company, but in general, that we just wanted to make sure.
These are not the words we're saying.
Yes, we're just denoting because of the time frame this comes from. Right after the Harlem Renaissance,
words, yes, there were different words that were acceptable for black people back then. Like when I say acceptable, that black people accepted as they wanted to be called this, or whatever.
Yeah.
So those are the words they use to brand things, and we're going to say those words when we talk about the companies that they owned or whatnot. Because that's the name of the company, but we're not saying those words as that's what we think they should be called or something. So,
exactly.
Anyway, that's good you said that.
Yeah. I was just thinking we're about to get into
Let's get into this book. Oh my God, I can't believe you said that. So, the first guy they talk about is an interesting guy to start with because he's got kind of like he's like the only guy in here who you could be like, oh, he's not tarnished, but you might think he's tarnished now because of kind of the way he went about it towards the end of his life.
Yeah.
But his name was he was born Adolphus Barreau Grippon, but I think he wrote under Adolphe Leslie Barreau, and so he was like a guy from South Carolina, I think it was, or North Carolina, one of the Carolinas, and he came up and like went to art school and stuff like that. And all of these guys have a very or not all of them, a lot of these guys have a very similar story of we're going to art school to become fine artists. And then, times are hard because the Depression or war or whatever. I have to do this comic thing to pay the bills and then, move on from there. So it's kind of interesting how they all kind of have that story. Now, some of them don't, but a large majority of them do have that same story kind of thing. But this guy had that story, but what was different about him, as opposed to the majority of these creators in this book, is he could pass as white. And he's also the oldest, or he goes the furthest back in this compared to the other guys. So he starts like in the early 1900s, I believe, with his art. Mm-hmm. But he was born during, I think, either right after the Civil War or around that time. So he was like around for it, while it was going on. So when he moves up north, he literally just changes his whole identity. He goes from like Adolphus Grippon. He's like, no, fuck that. I'm moving to, I think he goes to New Jersey, and he's like, I think it might be Philadelphia. I can't remember. A lot of these stories kind of are in the same areas. Yeah. So I get like blended together a little bit, but he like totally changed his name. Just was like, yeah, no, I'm not from there. I'm not this person or whatever. Like just ignored all that. And he could pass as white up north. And so he was just like, yeah, I'm white. He would mark white on all his stuff. And there you go. He's not mixed or anything. And so he just went with that. Like that was his identity. So a lot of the people didn't even know that he was black when he's writing these comics or
he's doing art, a lot of children's stories.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So the reason why I say like some people might have a problem with the way that he lived or whatever it wasn't just that he passed as white and was like, oh, I have to do this, which he did. He did have to do this to make a living or whatever. Yeah. But he kind of like leaned into it, and he was like I guess he went into like he was new Strom. I think his name's Strom Thurmond. Or Senator Thurmond. That was like a very racist senator. Yeah. He was the guy that was like, Alabama will always stay segregated forever. Yeah. And like he was the guy at the the school with the little black girl that was walking in for the first unsegregated school or whatever. So yeah, like he just like leaned into that because I think he just felt he had to in his life, or at least that's what I got from this book. And then from the podcast, the way that Ken Quattro was talking about him was like, yeah, I mean, obviously when you're back then, you're just trying to survive. if you're black and you're just like, okay, this is the path I'm going to take because I want to do art. I can pass as white up here, and that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to lean into that hard so that no one even questions my heritage or any of that kind of stuff. So, I would say like the art that he had just kind of looked like normal comic strip art back then, you know.
Yeah, I would say there's several guys in this that you could tell they all went to school, they all got their basic chops, and they all kind of fit that format of like what you think of when you think of those old style cartoons.
Right.
I mean, it's like, oh, yep, that's a comic strip. Oh, yep, those are people walking. Oh, yep, that guy has a cape. You know, that's what a laser beam looks like.
Right.
It's just kind of like standard format. Not that it's not good.
Right.
It's like everything looks great. It's just like kind of like that standard process of, and well, again, what you think of when you think of old comics.
Yeah, and Adolphus was interesting. Like, I'll say that Ken Quattro was talking about why he didn't include like the creator of Crazy Cat and some of the other creators like that were black that did comic strips or other kind of art.
Yeah,
like you said, political cartoons and stuff. Because these guys did that too, but they actually did comic books, which was like a new medium at the time.
Yeah.
So it's specifically for comic books that's why he picked to start with this guy, because he was the first comic book artist that was black, that I guess that he could find, at least in America. So, but the cool thing about this was they showed his one of his comics that he's known for, and it's called Sally the Sleuth. And I had a blast reading this.
Oh yeah, that was really fun actually.
This was one of the ones I was like, wait, this is before Stan Lee, because you know, Stan Lee, like we said already, you know, he talked a lot in his fucking comics. And this was like well written, and there was like just enough dialogue on the page, and you know, you know, they were out of the way of the art that was going on. I could see everything fine, so I was like, wow, like this is like ahead of its time. Even like the layout of the pages, I was like, I feel like this is ahead of its time as far as, you know, what I've seen on other, like from Marvel in the 60s.
Yeah.
You know, they develop, you know, they're known, like Steve Ditko's known for his, you know, 4 and 6 panel layouts for pages. And it's like, well, it seems like this guy did a lot of that too, or whatever. So like maybe a lot of the things that we know from our favorite authors and artists that we know, you know, from Marvel and DC, you know, maybe
they may have borrowed.
Well, I just mean like, not even that, but just it's the language is already developed, and they just maybe improved for whatever they were doing, and that's when it got noticed.
Yeah.
But like in this, I was like, oh, this is like better. Like the pages are laid out great, and also the dialogue is not fucking overwhelming it like Stan Lee does. So, but this Sally the Sleuth was like a great comic read. Like you said, what was the part you said you thought was funny?
I was fine. So she's like an undercover like FBI agent, and she's working. There's been a bunch of females that have been murdered, and so she's undercover, and she escapes one guy, but she didn't get a look at his face. But then later, when they're at another scene, she says, "Oh yeah, I recognize the smell on this guy. I knew it had to be the same guy.
I recognize that guy's smell.
Yeah, his smell was like the smell of like I assume like you know like with booze because they kind of he kind of looks like a grizzly kind of a what you consider like old school drunkard kind of character.
Yes.
So it was it's like okay, I get what she's saying.
It could have been some other smell though. We don't know.
That's true.
He doesn't bathe much. He's a sailor.
Yes.
So. But yeah, so that was like cool to see kind of his like when like I said, when these guys or when he's writing about what they did, you're like, okay, I can like picture in my head, oh, they did that comic and they did this comic. But to actually read it, you're like, oh wow, this is way better than I thought it was gonna be. The next guy that they bring up is kind of a good follow-up because like we said, Adolphus was white passing, so he had a bit of a different like pathway than some of the other guys, and it was kind of contrasted by the next guy in this book who was Elmer Cecil Stoner is his name, and this guy was the name of this chapter is called the Harlem Renaissance Man. Mm-hmm. So he was like leaned into his blackness, and it was like he was celebrating being black and being an artist, and he still got hired by white magazines or white comic book companies because, like I said, they're not crediting anybody, and a lot of these people weren't working in the same offices and shit. So it was like, oh, let me get that script and I'll send it to you and you take it home and you draw it and then bring it back. And that's all. The only time anybody sees you is when you deliver your pages to me. So it doesn't matter that you're black.
It said his art was in the first issue of Detective Comics. I mean,
yes. And also he worked on Blue Beetle.
Yeah.
Which, you know, is a character for DC now. But like, this is the original, the Dan Garrett Blue Beetle. But like, which I was reading some of these and I was like, wow, these are ridiculous. So I kind of wish they would reprint these, but they probably don't even have actual things to reprint.
Yeah, who knows? If
like I said, they just threw this stuff away after a while. So they at least have the covers for reprint here, and they do reprint one issue later on that you can read, and it's pretty funny when you go through it. But yeah, he like worked on Blue Beetle, which is a very well known. Well, he's like a DC character that people know. I'm a big fan of Blue Beetle. All right, so I'm a follower.
I'll say Matt is a big fan of Blue Beetle, but I mean, enough people I think have at least seen that kind of character. Now, it's not the same.
DC has talked about releasing a show or a movie about him, so that's at least in the zeitgeist of comic book things that might get made now. So yeah, like he was in that, or he drew that, and then he would talk about, or he was like involved in the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s. And that was like a big thing with a lot of these artists that like they were in that scene. They all kind of either worked around or were in the same areas and maybe knew each other. I'm not sure. Some of them did know each other and some of them just ran in the same circles. So, but it was very cool. And then this guy specifically after comics, because like I said, they're just they're just like dipping their toe into comics to pay bills. They're not, you know, like, oh, I'm going to be a comic book artist for my life or whatever. This guy ended up being like a really good painter that would do like ads for, you know, liquors and stuff in the 70s and very like sophisticated looking art, which I thought was cool. But yeah, the cover of Blue Beetle, which is actually from 1944, is him punching Hitler, which is a common picture on a lot of comic book covers back then. I'm sure we all know the Captain America image of him punching Hitler that I think Jack Kirby drew with Joe Simon writing on that one.
Yeah.
But yeah, so he had a very like I said, he had a different kind of career path because he didn't pass as white, but he was still able to be successful in comics and in fine art as well. And of course, those things got easier as time got closer to the Civil Rights Movement, and then after the Civil Rights Movement, and those kinds of things became easier. And then, you know, they were able to actually, like I said, get contracts, you know, for advertising and things like that. And then well known, like people wrote articles and stuff about them later on when they're older about their fine art side. Then like once again, no one gives a fuck about their comic book side.
Yeah.
So they'd be like, this is the artist of this ad or whatever.
Yeah.
Like who cares about that? But apparently they care about that more than comics. So that was interesting.
Oh, yeah, he did these ads, or he did these like there's a gentleman coming up. He Robert Savon Pius. He did like one of the like World's Fair posters. You know, so it's like, oh yeah, well that's Even,
well, that makes sense because at least the World's Fair is kind of important back then or whatever. Yeah. That would be like, oh, holy crap! But like, who gives a fuck about like, oh, it's some gin company.
Oh yeah,
they did the art for fucking Jack Daniels. Who cares or whatever for this 1 year? It's not even like, you know, the bottle art or something. It's just like the ad that's on, you know,
was in these magazines.
Yeah. So it's kind of funny how like stuff is highlighted by the press or whatever. But yeah, so. Who was the first guy that stood out to you in this book? Because there's a lot of creators, and it took a while for them to, like, for their art to really stand out to me to go, oh, this guy is fucking awesome.
Yeah, I was thinking, so like I looked at Pius stuff, and I did like a lot of his like actual art too.
Yeah, Pius didn't really stand out to me as like, and it seemed like,
but as a comic, yeah,
as a comic book artist, he didn't stand out to me. But he was definitely, I think, one of the guys that was like, yeah, I'm really just doing this to pay bills. Like, I don't give a fuck about like really doing the best work possible on this or something, you know?
Yeah, I liked J. Paul Jackson had some cool stuff. He had the one that was the blonde Garth. I don't know if you remember that one. He was the guy who like fought a shark.
Yes. Well, okay. So Jackson's shark drawing wasn't the thing that got me. I was like, oh, that kind of looks more like standard comic book, especially the shark's anatomy on that. I was like, wow, they really don't know what sharks look like back then, because there's a couple comics with sharks in them, and I'm like, the fuck are they drawing from? And I guess, it's just whatever people have caught and hoisted out a shark.
Yeah.
So they're like, oh, that's what a shark looks like hanging up, from the sky or whatever.
Well, from this angle, I bet yeah.
Yeah, they're like, they don't know at all what it looks like underwater because there's, I don't know, there's no diving movies or anything going on. No one's made the Meg yet, we haven't seen what sharks look like underwater.
Well, he did some really cool science fiction stuff too. Is that what you were getting at?
Yeah, well, I was going to get at, he did this thing called Home Folks, which was specifically aimed at like black
Oh,
people.
yes, okay.
And it was like supposed to be kind of like a black version of some other comic that was just like looking at the average day of modern, kids or whatever from society. So, but this was like black kids from society. And this specifically being from 1951 looks like I was like, wow, is this looks like it was in Playboy or Mad Magazine or, up there with like the Tales from the Crypt guys or whatever, the EC Comics art. I was like, wow, this looks really, really good. And that was the first one I was like, this stands out comparatively to the other stuff that we see. So, but the shark one did not get me that he drew.
I think it's because we just read Hookjaw a couple.
That's what it is. Hookjaw was so good.
So it was in the back of my mind. I was like, oh, look, another shark story.
It just made me laugh because I was like, they have no idea what a shark looks like back in the 40s or whatever. Like they're just like, yeah, I mean, it's that thing we catch every now and then whenever one attacks someone or whatever. So they're just like
accidentally get one when they pick up a whole bunch of
tuna or whatever. Yeah, they're like, it's got a fin on the back, right? And it's kind of got a mean face.
Yeah, it always looks angry, right?
Yeah, other than that, it's just like a blob. It's kind of a blob with a tail and a fin on it. So, yeah, it kind of looks like, what's that? That you got cartoon in the 70s that was like Shmoo or something like that?
Oh, the Shmoo? Yeah.
Yeah, the Shmoo. It looks like that, but you put a fin on it and a tail, and there you go. You got the Shmoo. So that's what I was literally like, what the fuck is this shark? Like, but they didn't have any reference for it, so I understand that. But yeah, like some of the artists in here, they were just kind of notable because of their, they were big as far as like they made an impact politically and stuff too. So they were like in that area, and then also they worked on things that were notable of that time.
Yeah,
but I wouldn't say they were necessarily the best artists or anything.
No, there was Owen Charles Middleton. That was one in particular that kind of like, and that was also because of his backstory too, because he actually went to prison.
Okay, yeah, this was the first guy I was like, this dude stands out.
Yeah.
So Charles Middleton, which I was like, I want to see his artwork because he seemed from his his story, I was like, it doesn't say he was trained at all. It just says like, yeah, he was he went to prison. He was so I guess back in the day, and they still have these fucking laws now every now and then, but they'll come up where it's like especially drug laws in the 80s were like this, where like if you have 3 times of carrying drugs on you when you get arrested, even if it's like I have a joint, and then the next one is I have 2 joints, and then the next one is I have a dime bag of weed. Well, that's 3 felonies, and you're getting fucking 20 to life or whatever for having weed on you. There was one of those where it was like if you commit 3 felonies, just in general, felonies of any kind. It didn't mean if they're like D-list felonies or murder. It was like if you commit 3 felonies, you go to jail for life. And of course, I'm sure that was not used on everybody because not everybody's getting arrested for felonies all the time.
Yeah, and then especially you think on minority groups, like I'm sure that it was like, oh, what did you do? Well, jaywalking is a felony in this town, so
yes,
like they're gonna find a reason.
Yeah, but Middleton was, I guess he had. I don't know if he robbed. I can't remember what his felonies were, but he got 3 felonies, and he was like the first person to get thrown in jail for life from this law. So the newspaper wrote about it.
Yeah.
And because of that, there was like some philosophical, or there was some magazine that was doing a story on what is the value of human life. Like that was the question they were posing to certain people around the globe, important people and whatnot. And they just read this and they're like, well, what's his viewpoint on this? So they wrote him, I believe, and just asked him to give them like, his response to that question. And the response he sent back was so like moving and philosophical that they're like, holy shit, like this guy, like moved us and like our readers, and so they started a campaign to get him released and to ban that law. So they actually got that law overturned because of this, and he got out of prison after like 5 years or something like that. So he was still in there, and he had to go to like he went
to Sing Sing.
He went to Sing Sing for 5 years. I think it was 5 years, something like that. And he was thrown in, like, because he was drawing and stuff, which is considered contraband. Yeah. They put him in like solitary confinement for having contraband and stuff like that. For fucking, I think what he did was he like robbed someone when he was really young, and then like he never killed anybody or anything. It was just kind of like he would be involved in these schemes to like, oh, we'll bring water guns and we'll rob the jewelry store, and no one dies, and they get caught in the process before it happens or whatever. But that's enough to get them, thrown in jail or whatever, or to get, charged on the felony. So stuff like that. It wasn't like good stuff necessarily, but you definitely know to be in life in prison for that. So from that, he was part of like, or he gets released, and he was part of like the American. I believe he's a communist in this, so he like was part of that communist movement that was going on. Because I mean, at the time, this is before World War II. Or before the Cold War, I guess was when we really were like, we don't like communists. But they were like the rhetoric that was around about communism was it's all equal. You could be a woman, you could be black. It doesn't matter because we're all proletariat or whatever, right? That's the ideal or whatever of their thing is anybody can be part of our movement because we don't care about your race and stuff. So. And they were like, and a lot of this stuff was anti-fascism at the time because we're in the middle of World War II. So so like, or at least that's building up in a lot of these places. So, a lot of them are anti-fascist, and they would put things, and I liked this a lot. They would have art that they drew where it would be like a crow being strangled, and it would say like, end Jim Crow or whatever, and then there would be like, because the Japs, and this is what they said that's not my word, and they would say, because the Japs and the Hun or whatever, are fans of it or something like that. They would try to equate Jim Crow laws or just segregation.
Or they had like a little Nazi flag around the crow's
neck or foot or whatever. Yeah. So they would definitely like try to equate those two things. So maybe someone reading that or sees that who's not black or not necessarily
it's not the first thing on their mind.
Yeah. They would go, oh, what does that mean? Like, are those the same thing? And then it might make them think and whatnot. So, he definitely like liked political cartoons, very and that was like his thing. He was like, I want to do political cartoons more than comic books, but he did draw some comics, and that's why I was saying like his comics weren't really his focus, so I didn't really care about his art too much in this. But there was one really cool comic that I liked the cover of called Spy Smasher. That was pretty badass. I thought like the way it was like the cover's got like a pilot, I guess, and then there's like boats behind him, like battleships and stuff, and then there's like this hand coming out of the water that looks all demony and shit. I was like, oh, that looks badass. So yeah, he was just really well known for his like his art, his political cartoons and stuff, which I liked a lot. Yeah. But other than that, like I wasn't really like impressed by his comic book art, but his political cartoons were very, very, very good.
Oh yeah, they're very good.
And very like hard hitting and meaningful. I would say. But the first guy that really stood out to me was Clarence Baker.
Yes. Okay. Okay. I knew he would stand out to you. I mean, maybe
for the art.
For the art. but yeah, I agree too. Like he had some really cool stuff.
Well, yeah, Middleton was the one who stood out to me because his story was different than a lot of the people here. There's only one other guy who had a similar kind of. He just kind of meandered through his life into comics, but like he wasn't really trying to become a comic artist. And then also he had all these crime things happen with him where he got thrown in prison and all this stuff. So his journey was very different than everybody else's. So I really liked his story because of that. In fact, I would be like, hey, let's get this one dude, let's pull him out and take like a really in-depth, vision of, or like like really go into his life in depth about in a book or something. Like I wouldn't mind reading a whole thing about him. But The first guy that really stood out art-wise to me was this guy named Clarence Baker. And this was actually the guy that Ken Quattro started looking into.
Yeah.
Because he at least was more well-known, I think, than the other people. And I didn't know that until I had to re-listen to the podcast. Because when I listened to it the first time, I hadn't read the book.
Yeah.
I was just like, oh, that's a cool book. It sounds like a cool book. And then I read the book, and then I was like, oh, this is the guy I like. And then when I heard him talk, I'm like, oh, that's like why he wrote the book. Like, it makes sense because this dude really stands out as far as his art. Like, very, very iconic as far as, like, just the artwork in general. I was like, this is, like, super tight line work, black and white. I mean, if I saw this on the page now, I would be like, if a comic came out nowadays with this art, I would be like, who's this guy? This guy's like got a fresh style or whatever. You know? like really cares about detail and stuff. So I was very surprised. All the covers I saw from him were like really, really good. I don't know. Like he has one called Cinderella Love in here. Just the cover, I was like, wow. That just blew me away how good it looks for an old book, you know.
For sure. I thought this is definitely falls under that the cake term that you
okay, yeah. He definitely
like.
he likes a little cheesecake in it, you know, which is the I guess it's called fan service for manga people or whatever. But you know, he draws a voluptuous woman, we'll say,
but
skimpier clothes.
But also to be fair, he was actually one of the first known to actually have a lot of these female heroines as like his main focus in in his art.
Yes.
So that was really cool. Like, not
only that, he also drew the first black hero in a comic book, which, you know, that's before Black Panther or any of those characters. He drew a character called Vuda that was the first black person or black hero on a cover of a comic book. And it's funny because he's saving a black woman, and it's still in Africa and stuff. Because a lot of these comics were like, a lot of them were, there's a white guy like Tarzan who goes to Africa, becomes so good at whatever the black people are doing there.
White savior.
He's the white savior, basically. He can do everything but better, you know? And then he saves the tribe or whatever from the bad people. So a lot of the comics were that. So he drew one where the black guy was just, you know, in Africa fighting white people. And he was on the cover, which is, I mean, think about at the time.
That's true. Looking at like,
yeah, you're at the newsstand. You're a little kid, and there's a black guy on the cover. You know, a black hero on the cover. It's not, you know.
Yeah, he's not a villain.
He's not a villain. He's not the mailman. He's the hero of the book. Like, that was probably pretty big for a black kid or whatever back then to see in the newsstands and then, you know, want to pick up or whatever.
Yeah.
The company did end up pussying out or whatever. Like, they totally, apparently, by like, so they had him on the cover on issue 1. I think on issue 2 they were like, let's put a white guy on the cover. Like, I think they ended up putting him. No, I think it's at issue 4. They did regular covers with him being black, and people were like, is this a misprint? Like, you know, sometimes the color gets printed wrong on the covers, and so people thought, is this a misprint? And then 2 and 3 came out and he was black. They're like, oh no, he's a black character. And then 4, they're like, we're getting some letters or something from white people, so let's just make him white guy. So then they ended up making him a white guy, which is always fun.
Yeah,
when they do that. So they changed him just cause, I guess. But that was groundbreaking, and the art in this comic book was like solid. Like, everything this guy did, you could tell he was like into comics and like doing the best art, or maybe not even into comics, maybe just into his art being the best possible or whatever. And one thing that was interesting about this is where we start seeing like names that I know in comics. Like Clarence Baker worked with Will Eisner, the guy who created the Spirit, and he worked at the Iger studio. He was the only black artist to be like on staff at the Iger Eisner studio.
That's cool.
So there's some other people in this book that worked as well for Iger, but they weren't on staff. They were just hired like per page or whatever, or per comic. So it was like work for hire stuff. So he would contact them and, you know, send out the pages to them. But this guy actually worked, you know, arm in arm, you know, on a drawing table next to white people, white artists, like Will Eisner and Al Feinstein and stuff.
Yeah.
Or Feldstein, I'm sorry. Al Feldstein was, worked for EC Comics and all that kind of stuff. So, like, just really, people that I've heard of, in the comic book world a lot. And he's working right there with them.
And some names I've heard of.
Some names you might have heard of sometimes, John. Yeah. That was we were talking about that. I'm like, oh, this person. You're like, I don't know who that is. But yeah, and so that was very interesting to see, like, this guy really got in there, and it was based a lot on just his art was fucking killing it.
Oh yeah.
Like he was undeniable even for being a black artist at the time. Like, he was just like, wow, you're really good. So
was it the Phantom Lady? That was
Phantom
really,
Lady was really
cool looking.
Yeah.
One of the things too about him, and it's a really sad note, is he died so young.
Yeah.
He was 37.
Yeah.
And I guess he said, he was a heavy smoker and he had like heart issues and stuff.
Yeah, and it was in his family, like heart issues were in his family too. So he just, I don't think back then they were like, smoke 2-packs for extra
That's true.
health or whatever.
You know what? Yeah, you know what'll help that cough? Smoke 2-packs this week.
Yeah, and make sure they're Marlboros because
Yeah.
they pay us extra for packs. So yeah, there was just some really cool like connections that were brought up in that specific guy's history. It was like, oh, this is where it's really getting into the people that I've heard of.
And he's like it's like the official first like graphic novel too, right? Before they were like actually coined graphic novels.
Call them graphic novels,
but he's like in the first of that.
Yes, he was like part of the I guess because the Iger group or whatever was part of that whole thing. So
yeah,
I don't know what that was, like, as far as I've never heard of it or anything. So what they talked about that being.
Yeah.
So I wonder what it looked like. Like, what was the format? What was it? Just a collection, or was it actually like an original graphic novel? Because that's what it ends up being in the 80s. Is it's an original graphic. It's an OGN or whatever, and this from the mind-blowing mind of Frank Miller or whatever. We're gonna make a story that has nothing to do with the regular comics. It's its own universe, basically, unless it's really good, and then we want to include it into continuity, like Killing Joke or something, with Barbara Gordon getting shot, like stuff like that. So, but yeah, I'm sure it's like the first concept. That concept is interesting because it gets played around. Like, I'm sure back then they were like, what if we just printed like a fat book of these things or like a fat story? And people are like, nah, that'll never sell. Or, well, they do it once and it doesn't sell great. So like, let's just go back to what it was. And then like 20 years later, 10 years later, they'll try it again and it didn't sell that great or whatever. So like until the 80s, it doesn't really take off. Yeah. So it's kind of interesting how it might have been one of the first or the first, but because like they never reprinted it or do anything with it other than release it once, it kind of fizzles out or whatever. But it's at least worth noting that he was part of that. So the other guy that kind of stood out was Alvin Hollinsworth. He was like one of the first guys to do horror in this book. Like he would work on horror comics, and he would do. I liked his story because he started out doing comics, and he had like really good detail work, and he had a character named the Bronze Man who was like because bronze was a different word they would use sometimes for black or brown people. There was like a nice word, So they're like, oh, you're bronze or whatever, and so. Him having a white character that wore a bronze mask was probably or possibly Ken kind of alludes to in this book, him being allowed to write a black hero without having to actually be a black hero, because the mask was there. And he was like a disfigured war vet, I think is what the guy was. So he would put on a bronze mask that made him look bronze, at least on the face. And so it was kind of like him getting to work on a black character without it being officially a black character kind of thing. At least that's how Ken kind of...
And it said that he appeared in Blue Beetle, right? That was where...
Yes, I think some of these were... It's weird because like Charleston is owned and then collapses and then owned again, and then like they would reprint stuff, and so some of these are like kind of like getting... I wasn't sure on some of these because it was like when we talked about Porter... Is it Porter? The guy at the beginning... the guy that wrote Blue Beetle at the beginning, Stoner, Elmer Stoner. He worked on Blue Beetle, but then later on, there's another guy who worked on Blue Beetle like way later, And it was like, oh, well, were they like contemporaries, or were there like years between these issues? You know, they didn't really talk about the years. Like you could see, I mean, he put dates on the covers and stuff.
Yeah.
But if you weren't paying attention to all those dates and keeping them in your mind while you're reading it, like I wasn't, you might not have. I didn't get that they were like right after the other. Not like nowadays where you have issue 100 and then the next month issue 101. You know, it might have been like the company collapsed and they got bought. Then they started up with issue 2 again, and it was already 5 years later or something, So who knows? But the thing I liked about Hollingsworth was his story about his art was very cool. Where
I agree.
He becomes like he goes from like really good comic book artist that's like really solid art in comics, and goes to become like a weird like impressionist. Like he just keeps expanding as an artist all through his life.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
continuously. Where he's like pushing boundaries, and they call him like they said he's becoming like this is Picasso period where like it's all just impressionist and you can't tell exactly what everything is on the page. Or
one of the things I wanted to say is he had one of the first like notable paintings of a black Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And I just thought that was cool because he goes into like, I always felt like Jesus was a black man. He's such a philosophical symbol of any of the modern prophets have been trying to show us the right way, like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King.
Right.
And I just thought that was cool. It was like, he has this comic career, and then like you said, like he goes into art, and then he goes into the he really kind of like just kind of really shows that the contemporary, and then like he goes and it does a lot of civil rights paintings as well. And wasn't he a college professor too?
Yeah, yeah. A lot of these people ended up becoming like teachers and stuff too later on.
So it was just cool to see, like, he just, like you said, he just kept progressing into like more
different kind of art.
Yeah. It was really cool.
I liked that. I like just hearing, not that like obviously comic book artists are great and I love them, but like for these guys who that wasn't their life goal to be a comic book artist, it was just to be a fine artist or to be an artist in general, with like really well known gigs or at least making a name for yourself in the art world. A lot of them did get to do that, which is cool to see. And this guy specifically would push the boundaries on what, like, I was surprised that, like, he would still do art for magazines and stuff, like political cartoons or, I think it said he worked for Playboy or some kind of magazine like that. And while he was in his impressionist stage, and they were still like, yeah, it's fine. Like, so you would think they'd be like, we want you to do what you did before, not what you're doing now, kind of thing. So he was able to do that, which I thought was cool. Another thing I thought was cool is that he worked alongside Joe Kubert, who is known best for his, I think, DC characters, Sergeant Rock. He worked on a lot of war books for DC.
Yeah.
And, of course, he has the Joe Kubert School for Making Comics. I don't know what the actual name is, but something like that. Or
the Kubert School of, yeah.
Yeah, Kubert School of Comics, whatever. I'm sure if you've ever read a comic from the 80s, that ad is in every fucking issue of every comic because that's like the school for making comics. So lots of people went to that school. I mean, okay, if you're talking about artists who went to that school, we're talking Steve Bissette, who drew Swamp Thing for Alan Moore. We're talking Yeet, who drew, I'm saying all the Swamp Thing people because literally everybody who worked on Swamp Thing while in the 80s was someone from that school. So you had Yeats did it in the early, before Alan Moore's run. Then during Alan Moore's run, you had Bissette, who was a student there. Then you have Rick Veitch after him, who also was a student there. They all went to that school, and they were all friends from that school. So it's just like the influence. That's one of the most like influential comics of the 80s, and it's like, they always went to that school. So there's a lot of influence from that. And he knew him, and actually Joe Kubert in interviews would talk about Alvin Hollinsworth as like, oh yeah, his art was fantastic, and I actually learned some stuff from him because we worked in the same shop or whatever, and I was like, oh, that's cool. I never seen anybody do that or whatever. So like things like that I thought was pretty cool. So yeah, it just it was just nice to hear like actual people talk about him from the comic book industry that I know, like, because while they talk about like Clarence Baker worked at the Eisner studio, I don't have quotes from Eisner on this, but Joe Kubert being a little bit more contemporary could actually give quotes or remember
Yeah.
him. That was the other thing. Like I said, some of these people didn't even know they were working with black people. So they were just, oh yeah, I didn't even know that he was black. In fact, I didn't even know who he was at all. Like they didn't tell me the guy you're working with is James.
Yeah.
They didn't even tell me his name. So I just was like, oh, I didn't even know I worked with James or whatever, you know. So I just thought that was nice that these people actually got to know each other and they got along, and you know they're all both in. He influenced one of the influencers of a lot of people, kind of thing. So, and then the other guy that stood out, and I like this guy a lot, Alfonso Green. This guy was kind of like Owen Middleton. He was not like the other people. He was not a fine artist, dude.
Yeah.
He was a felon who
grew up on the street.
And he was like a gang, as a gang member. But the greatest thing was he went to school with Alex Toth. One of the if you don't know who Alex Toth is, look him up. He's one of the most influential comic book artists of the 60s, 70s, ever, actually. I mean, of all time. Yeah. But he actually has some quotes in this book about Green saying like, oh, he was fucking awesome and like we got along really well together. And it was just like really cool. He also worked for Stan Lee. So he worked for Stan Lee I'll say it in order. So he was a gang member who went to prison for 5 years. And then as he got out, and I like this, I don't know why we can't do this anymore. He worked for Stan Lee at Timely Comics. So it was like, there was literally a sentence where like, and he went to prison for 5 years. And then he got out and worked for Stan Lee at Timely Comics. I'm like, how do you, like nowadays you can't get a fucking job if you have a felony or something. Back then, you could get out, and if you were trying to rehabilitate yourself or you were rehabilitated, you're just trying to get a job and live your life after the mistake you made, you could do that. And you could work for fucking Stan Lee at Marvel before they were Marvel. Yeah. And, I just thought that was really cool that he did that. The sad thing about this story, though, is no one knows anything about him after he worked for Stan Lee. Apparently, he went through some hard times where, the comics companies collapsed in the 60s or no, in the 50s because of the seduction of the innocents and all the communists searching for and all that in media, and the book that came out, The Seduction of the Innocents, that was from a psychiatrist saying like comic books are turning your kids gay and turning you into communists and all this stuff. So like we hate those now. There was comic book burnings and things like that. So that kind of collapsed the comic book industry. So he wasn't getting work anymore. And then it says like we're not for sure about this history. We're kind of guessing based on records we found. But there was an Adolfo Green who got arrested for attempted robbery later on, and then he ended up he didn't get in trouble for that. Like it was like he got thrown out. The case got thrown out for like I guess him and four guys were standing on a corner next to a jewelry store or something with guns, like if they were ready to rob the store or whatever. Like the guns were in their pocket. The cops came up and said, "Hey, show us your pockets or whatever. Why are you standing here?" And then he got arrested, and they were trying to say he was trying to rob the store, but I guess it got thrown out because he was just standing around with weapons or whatever. So that's kind of what happened to him, possibly, because like the guy who got arrested, one of the guys was named Green, Alfonso Green, and so that's like what potentially happened. And then a guy with the same birthday and name died in 1977, but no one knows if that was him or not, kind of thing. So like he just kind of goes away in the ether or whatever, which unfortunately, but he had a very cool like style and stuff, and I just liked his story. It was kind of different than everybody, and the fact that he got to work with Stan Lee a bunch, and like there was just a bunch of quotes from Stan Lee and Alex Toth about this guy who went into the ether, but like he influenced, or at least was in the lives of these giant creators that I've heard of all my life, but no one talks about him. So I thought that was cool.
But why? Yeah, exactly. Why was it Alfonso Green's name brought up if they all worked with it and they all have these great things?
Well, no one. I mean, when they asked Toth about him, he'd be like, "Oh yeah, it was great. I loved him." But because, like, once again, it's like these artists, since no one talks about them, they just get forgotten, or no one asks about them, so they get forgotten, and no one knows to ask, and no one is looking. So now that people are looking, maybe some of this history of more than just comic books, but other, people of color, maybe they'll get some histories found and all that kind of stuff. So it would be nice if some more of these kind of books and histories get talked about.
I was going to say, I gasped. And I agree. I look forward to hopefully, getting to know about more of these kind of stories, because it's wild to learn these kind of things. The things that obviously we should be taught in school that we would learn now, like
like
Black
this wouldn't
Wall
get
Street
talked about in school.
But this wouldn't. Yeah, this wouldn't. But this is something that we're interested in. It's like,
right.
oh wow, like
this would be like
I never would have
a college class in the history of comics.
Yeah,
there would be like African Americans in comics would be a section of that class, and then you would talk about all these guys, and then there would be women in comics, and then you talk about the women, that kind of thing. So you there would be like an in-depth class on a certain subject or something. But I mean, like even you said, other histories that for sure should be taught in history class have been glossed over. So I'm sure it's going to trickle down as far as, okay, those are going to get brought up in classes now. And then even these more like kind of esoteric or more in the corner, like in the back area kind of histories that people don't usually think about, they're going to get discovered too. And that's going to be cool for people. So like I was saying at the beginning, the book has a definite flow and, movement, and it starts at the beginning with Adolphus, and it goes to the end where we talk about the first all-black company and comic book that was put out, with the characters. Every character in this book is black.
Yep.
All the creators are black. So their names, the names of the creators were Orrin Evans, George Evans, John Terrell, William Smith, and Leonard Cooper. Mm-hmm. And they made the company called All Negro Comics. And this was in 1947. So a company that's run and the content of the comics are all just black people. It's pretty revolutionary for that time period. I mean, you're thinking this is on the stands next to all those white savior comics. We're talking about like Tarzan or whatever, and all the facsimiles of those. The amazing thing, I was like, if I was a kid back then, I'd be like, can we get a non-white or just like a non-hero from the jungle, comic? Like, what the fuck? Like, it's the same comic over and over and over, basically, with just different names of, Khazar and Cathor and Strongman or whatever. It's like
you see, there's so many cartoons from around that time too.
Yes, for sure.
All the same. The Herculoids or the He-Man and the whatever.
Mm-hmm, yeah. So this was like the first, like we said, all black creators and writers and artists
and characters.
Characters. Yeah, everybody in this book was black. So it was very cool to see like the actual reprints of this, because I was like, I can't believe that they actually got this issue to reprint from. They actually print a solid story from it from Ace Harlem, which is a cool character.
Yeah, Terrell created this character, Ace Harlem, and he's like a detective, gumshoe kind of character. Yeah,
and of course, there's there's criminals going around and like beating up people in barbershops and stuff like that. So it's just an interesting comic.
Yeah,
just to see. I was surprised that they could actually just even find it. Because I'm sure that they printed a lot of it, but it was we find out later at the end of this, because for reasons of fucked upness, there was only one issue. Issue 2 was planned and had all the stuff was ready to be printed.
Yeah, from the book's perspective, when you first read it, it was that it was they had everything ready to go, but they couldn't get the paper to do it. Yeah, they weren't able to get the paper.
But in the podcast that Ken Quattro was talking about, and maybe he just understated it in the book, maybe because it's writing, and he just didn't say it clearly enough in the book. But it was because white printers or white paper dealers wouldn't sell them paper.
Yeah,
so they couldn't print the second issue.
So they literally are like, now we're good. We're gonna force your all black owned company to not be in business anymore.
Yeah, so I mean, it was literally, there's no reason why it shouldn't have had a second issue if it was just based on sales and stuff like that. So it was very cool to hear about this being made in the 40s and that fact. And we should also say, I mean, one of the reasons why they got to do this, and directly after the 40s and during the 40s, a lot of these artists got jobs because it was white men were going to war, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of jobs opening up that people need to get done. Like, factories need to keep making shit.
Yeah, this is where all of this time is where you start seeing like
women,
women and all different minorities coming out and being able to fill those jobs that again were predominantly all white male because they were shipping them off to fight in the war.
Right. And even there was laws blocking black people and women, but black men from joining the military at first.
Yeah.
And then there actually black like the NAACP had to petition and protest and everything that they couldn't fight for the country that they supposedly are fighting. We're fighting fascism and horrible stuff like that over in, Germany or whatever, but we can't fucking fight for our country because we're so free over here or whatever. So there's just like a weird dichotomy that I guess America's history has always had when you look at George Washington owned slaves and so did Thomas Jefferson, but there's a fucking Declaration of Independence where we talk about all men being free and everything. So it's like the ideals of America never quite live up to the idea or ideals of what we should be.
Yeah, I will definitely say, and this is one thing, and I know it gets on a touchy subject, but there are these two visions of America where it's like this very whitewashed, we'll call it for lack of a better term, but this very idealistic and polished beacon of freedom and everything is great.
We're the light on the hill.
Yes, but like any country, no country is perfect, but like any country, we have this seeded history of some really messed up stuff that can only be fixed and made better by hearing these stories and learning about this and talking about this and moving forward. Because you can't fix a problem, or you can't you can't have people not know about something if you don't talk about it, don't learn about it, and you
can't just stick your head in the sand and ignore it.
Exactly, that's all. I want to get on a soapbox with it, but it's this is just
God, John, get off your soapbox. Everybody, this is John's soapbox. Welcome back to the newest podcast offshoot of our
offshoot.
Yeah. So that's a new one. That's John's going to start his own John's soapbox. He just talks about politics all day long.
Comics and politics. The politics of comics.
That'd be amazing and terrible. I would never listen to that podcast. It was interesting to hear all these stories together, and just the idea that like you said, America had this promise that I will say, I don't know, other countries might not have had the opportunities for them to even be able to do what they ended up becoming. Because even though they were black and a minority that were getting oppressed, especially at that time, they were still able to make things become fine artists and stuff like that, even though they struggled. Some of them had a harder time than others. Some of them passed as white because they had to. But those opportunities were still there, and a lot of them were. Some of them were from the government programs that were in the 40s during or in the 30s and 40s during the Depression, and that's why they were able to kind of make it out of there. Some of them were because of benefactors, I think Adolphus and a couple other guys had patrons that were I love your art, I'm rich and I own the equivalent of Walmart or whatever. Here's a bunch of money, go do what you want to do, that kind of shit. So.
That doesn't happen enough anymore.
Well, not at least that I know about. I'm sure someone does that.
No one's like, man, we love your podcast. Let me give you some money.
Well, one day Zuckerberg will hear our podcast and be like, you know what? I really like those guys. And we'll say, no, sir, we will not take your Facebook money.
We don't want your meta money. It's only good in the metaverse.
It's meta. Yeah. Oh, man. That'd be amazing. I'm paying you guys in meta bucks. What the fuck is
What's
that?
a meta buck?
What the fuck is that? But then, then I make a stupid move and be like, yeah, whatever. And then sell it for pennies on the dollar. And
that's true. That meta
10 years later, I could have been $1 billion.
Yeah, meta bucks are going to be the new Bitcoin or something.
Well, that's what fucking happened to Frank Cho, the artist, or not, is it Frank Cho? David Cho, the artist. He, I don't know who the fuck Frank Cho is. Just threw that out there. Frank. David Cho, apparently before Facebook was Facebook, did a mural at one of their buildings because they're like, oh, we really like your art. Can you do a mural? And they couldn't pay him or whatever. We'll pay you in Facebook stock. He's like, all right, whatever. So he did that, and then Facebook became Facebook, and now he doesn't ever have to work another day in his life.
Oh, wow.
multi-million-dollar or multi-millionaire because
he got some
just got paid with fucking Facebook stock or
That's
whatever
cool.
before, in 2000 or whatever the
Yeah.
fuck it was. So, we could be that. You know?
You never know.
But yeah, so it was interesting to see all these different artists and how they, came up. Some of them had very similar stories. A couple of them had very different stories. But they all were able to at least have careers in the art, and a lot of their art was very cool and groundbreaking, and really, interesting how they affected the other, the white comic book creators that ended up making big names like Stan Lee or Alex Toth or Will Eisner. They had an impact that now we get to see because of this book. So
Yeah.
I really like that, and that's why I really wanted to read this book for Black History Month, and I hope you all go check it out. I think I'm going to put up the link of the Amazon link of this. It's not an affiliate or anything. It's just so you guys can listen to this and just click on it from our podcast.
Yeah.
And you can check out the book and buy it, and it's really good. It's a really nice hardcover. So is there anything else you wanted to hit, John?
I'll just say the last gentleman in the book is Calvin Massey, and I guess I just wanted to mention just because he comes into the art
It's kind of like the new school, right?
The new
like
school, yeah, the modern age, yeah, because he died in was it 2000 and I want to say it was 2009.
Okay, yeah, that sounds about right.
No, I'm sorry, 2019. Yeah,
Okay.
it was really. I was like, I feel like it wasn't that long ago. Yeah, he had one of the longest one. He had like a 70-year career, and I just thought it was cool because he was influenced by some of these people that came before him here, and he worked with Stan Lee as well. He worked on Black Panther, Spider-Man, Thor, and it's cool because he a comic book artist, but also aspired to be a great artist as well. And he's one of the only black artists that has both statues designed and he comics art, and he also developed and created gold medals or medals that were used in the Olympics as well. Just like
cool.
it was such a wide swath.
Right.
Of
just
creativity.
And also you just tell it's a guy going like, I need, I'm paying bills, and like if they're gonna ask me to design stuff, sure, I'll design that or whatever. I'll draw what should be the logo for the Olympic medals and stuff like that. So that's cool. I like that.
So yeah, it was just cool to see that was he started out with again this niche of comic book writing and then or comic book artist to develop and grow into a large and long and illustrious career.
Yes.
So that's all. I just thought it was cool.
Going beyond comics, because like we said, a lot of these artists weren't trying to be comic artists. They just kind of fell into it when they needed to pay bills and stuff. So,
yeah.
Cool. Well, we're not going to rate this one because it's not a comic book.
Yeah.
And it's fantastic. So just check it out. And then,
yeah.
But if I had to rate this book, I would give it a 10. So, one of the few 10s in the podcast.
10.
So check this one out. And then next week, what are we reading, John?
Next week, we're going to tie it in. We've got a new comic movie on the horizon.
The Batman.
A once sparkly vampire now coming around, turning into a bat.
A sparkly bat?
I don't know. I'm excited either way.
We'll
I am actually intrigued. Yeah. But so we're going to read a comic book. It'll be partially, we've already done one that this was partially influenced by because they said that The Long Halloween was a big influence on this coming out.
Yeah.
But also this is Batman, very young in his career still, year 2 or 3, they said. So we're going to be reading Batman year 1.
Year 1. So it's a Frank Miller book.
We're not the Frank Miller podcast.
Yeah, but we might as well be. We've done all his other shit. So, hey, I'm a fan. So it's Frank Miller when he was right about the time he was doing Dark Knight. So I think it might be right before Dark Knight actually. So we're gonna do that. It's only 4 issues, so it's a nice quick story or small story, and it was very, very influential. So we will be reading that. And if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email us at planes, trains, and comic books, all one word, @gmail.com.
Don't forget check out our Instagram, Twitter, YouTube for exclusive content. We've got our coffee page. That's ko-fi patreon.com/planes, trains, and comic books if you'd like to support or join one of our wonderful tiers that we've got going up, where we've got Matt reading Hellblazer right along with the Matt's minis of Swamp Thing. So definitely check it out and support us if you.
And it's fucked up. I'll say that. It just gets every issue. I'm like, how do I talk about it? This is so heavy. There's so much fucking death and murder in it. So.
But thank you for coming along this journey with our Black History Month again. And with that, we'll see you on the next one.
On the next one.
Bye.